Christians who have chosen to keep the Sabbath or the food laws, they do it not for salvation, they say, but to be obedient. Can you unpack that whole deal?
They're simply contradicting themselves. If they're not doing it for salvation, but they're doing it for obedience, they've given with one hand and taken away with the other. Salvation, Hebrews 5:9, is by obeying Jesus, period. So you're simply making excuses for yourself. Paul said in Colossians 2:16 and 17, the trio of calendar observances, the holy days, the new moons, that's monthly, and the weekly Sabbath, those things are a shadow now made redundant by Christ, who is the fulfillment of that shadow. So for goodness sake, don't go back to the shadow when the substance belongs to Messiah, the risen Messiah. You need him as your Sabbath. You need him as your holy day. He's the only thing that counts. You're muddling, unfortunately, the two covenants. You're trying to mix Moses and Jesus, and that's not going to work. The whole book of Galatians profoundly against that idea.
So this distinction doesn't exist about salvation versus obedience.
No,
It's
no.
just a made-up thing. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely, absolutely. You're just contradicting yourself. If you're not doing it for salvation, why are you doing it? Now, you could argue this, I'll throw this in, that Paul himself said that if he wanted to go to a Jew who's under the law, he'll keep the Sabbath to keep him happy, to try to win him. He'll do all kinds of diplomatic things. But once you make Sabbath keeping your obligation, something you have to do to obey God or Jesus, you've gone way out of bounds. Though I myself, Paul, who is a Benjamite, he's an Israelite Christian, convert, apostle. I myself, Paul, am not under the law of Moses in the letter, that is. That should be absolutely clear. Let no one ever imagine anything more complicated than what Paul clearly says that. He does it simply to win others under the law. To those who are without that law, non-Jewish people, he'll be without that law. He's not going to keep it. But of course, he carefully says that he's within the law of Messiah. So you have to make up your mind, what is the law of Messiah and what is the law of Moses? Don't ever mix those things. That doesn't mean you can just get rid of all those laws, but they're being spiritualized. Circumcision being the classic case. Don't ever fuss about physical circumcision. Don't ever fuss about literal Sabbath keeping. Those are beyond the pale for the new covenant. And they simply make the faith complicated and more difficult for people to accept.
So you were a Sabbath keeper, Anthony.
Yeah.
You were in a system called Armstrong. You were taught and lived and believed that it's for obedience, not salvation.
No, we were taught it was for salvation because obedience is for salvation. There's no difference. We never entered our heads to make a distinction.
So it's the SDAs who make this distinction?
No, they would say that obedience to the week, they only do the weekly Sabbath. They would say that's for obedience. Of course.
I'm just trying to ascertain who then, what movement or group, or is it just individuals that have come up with the salvation versus obedience thing?
I think so. I think there would be, I don't think a whole denomination, as far as I know. Certain individuals say, well, we're not doing this for salvation, we're doing it for obedience. Wait a minute. Salvation without obedience is impossible.
So if I am going back into the shadow, as you say, as Paul says in Colossians 2, right? But I say to you, but look, Anthony, I'm still a follower of Jesus. What would you say to that person if they're trying to keep the Sabbath, the food laws, which is typically what the only things from the, 260 whatever laws.
Yes.
But I'm still following Jesus. Well, what do you make of that?
Well, I would say you're not following Jesus because you haven't understood that Paul is speaking for Jesus too. You're kidding yourself. You're not following Jesus if you're disobeying Paul. Jesus did not give the detail of the shift from Old Covenant to New Covenant in every respect, although himself, he did cleanse the food laws in Mark 7. He himself said that he was cleansing the food laws. They may not have understood that immediately. That became clear. On the other issues, he didn't clearly say, as clearly as Paul, that physical circumcision was wrong. He himself was circumcised. So you have to take the whole of Scripture. All Scripture is inspired. Paul is as inspired as Jesus. So don't kid yourself. You're not following Jesus if you're disobeying Paul. That's most important.